A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Gereva.
The 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany. The Olympic Games.
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Verkaufen Schabbat at the Skizar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be Katnusot.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide,
Yehuda Gabber with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode is sponsored in honor of the Adler and Kirsch families, a Freilich and Purim to them, and as this Chasam Sofer, who this episode is about, has been co-opted by so many groups within the Jewish community today, and he's almost universally viewed for both the leader he was and the universal appeal of his vast Torah teaching. So there's a certain consensus and unity around the character of Chasam Sofer, and that inspires unity and should inspire unity, which is also in the spirit of Purim, which is coming up, and we should all merit much unity together. So this next installment, this is part 4 on the series of the Chasam Sofer. This is going to be ongoing because Chasam Sofer is a bottomless pit, and there's plenty more to do, and obviously today we're just going to cover another facet of it. So the first 3 installments of the Chasam Sofer, and if I remember, I'll post the links to the first 3 episodes so you could be easily accessible in the text summary of this one. So the first one we had way back was about the Chasam Sofer's family. The second one was about the main aspect of his leadership and his legacy, is how he remembered of Chodesh Asher Min HaTorah and what that exactly means. We put that into context. And the third one we had was about his rabbinate and rabbinical leadership in the Pressburg Jewish community, today Bratislava in Slovakia, and how he related to that community. So those, we covered 3 aspects of the Chasam Sofer's life and accomplishments. And the goal I set for myself in this 4th episode is to talk about the youth of the Chasam Sofer, his early years in Frankfurt, his teachers, especially his main teacher, Rav Nosson Adler, and that's a fascinating story as well. So we'll get the youth of the Chasam Sofer covered so we can prepare our way for further and future episodes on him, which I guess we have in the future we'll cover. And of course you can contact me for sponsorships in that regard, yehuda@yehudageberer.com. Before we get into his youth, there's one thing I have to get back to that's been a recurring theme in the feedback I've gotten every single time we did something on the Chasam Sofer, and that was about how I mentioned a couple of times that he was a misnagid, an opponent to the Hasidic movement, and I tried to clarify it last time that I didn't mean that he was a misnagid in the sense of that he was against Hasidic teachings, which is definitely not the case, especially since he's a student of Rav Nosson Adler, which was quite similar in many ways, Kabbalistic, mystical, which we'll actually get to in this episode. And what I meant was in a communal sense, in a social sense, about separating from the community, establishing their own shuls, their shtibels, differing from the accepted Ashkenaz nusach. The changes, Chasam Sofer was against change. I thought I had clarified that in a previous episode, and I still got a lot of feedback about this idea that the Chasam Sofer, who's revered by the entire Hasidic movement today, and should be, and he definitely stands in his place, but he himself was definitely not Hasidic and was something of an opponent. So I got, instead of trying to clarify it again, one of the loyal and dedicated and quite knowledgeable listeners of Jewish History Soundbites sent me this fantastic summary, which he felt would be a very, very good clarification of what was meant. And I liked it so much that I'm pretty much just going to read it all straight up, and maybe I'll add in a word or two here and there to explain what I mean. So here it goes, and thank you to that listener out there who took the time to write this lengthy response and explain what it's all about. See, here's what he wrote. Enjoying the Chasam Sofer series. However, I want to comment on a theme that I think needs clarification. I think I know what you mean, but I fear that what you are trying to say is misinterpreted. It seems that you're going out of your way to point out that Chasam Sofer has been subject to a lot of revisionism, which of course is true. However, to most people, revisionism sounds like a terrible thing and is purposely distorting history, rather than the more common and less nefarious revisionism, which is simply filtering history through one's own prism, which I think is the case here. Let us all agree that the Chasam Sofer was the architect of how orthodoxy relates and can thrive in the modern era. He essentially created the blueprint that everyone uses to some degree. The fact that every group believes that they are following the Chasam Sofer's way not only proves that, but shows how successful his approach has been. It is not that everyone is interpreting his approach differently, rather everyone is taking his tools and applying it in different ways. The fact that many communities view in reverse, that their implementation is the way that the Chasam Sofer actually was, is typical and expected. Basically, what I'm saying that this revisionism is not a distortion of the Chasam Sofer, rather a positive proof of how widespread and impactful his contribution to our world truly is. Regarding him being a misnagid, first of all, he was not a misnagid in the Litvish or Vilna Gaon sense, or in the Naidi B'Yehuda sense for that matter. I think that was the point that many of your listeners were making. I don't think he had an issue with the Baal Shem Tov's Kabbalah or worldview. As you pointed out, it was more of the minhag and kehila side of things that the Chasam Sofer was opposed to in the Hasidic movement. Secondly, most Hasidim today, especially Hungarian ones such as Satmar, are a lot more like the Chasam Sofer than the Baal Shem Tov. I think that if both the Chasam Sofer and the Baal Shem Tov walked into Satmar today, the Chasam Sofer would feel much more at home than the Baal Shem Tov would. So maybe to some degree he was Hasidish as we view it today in many circles, and that Hasidish is in quotation marks. My point with Satmar and Hasidim was specifically regarding understanding the context of Misnagid and the modern day Chassid. What I mean to point out by Satmar was that even if he was a Misnagid, your modern day Chassid should not get offended or bothered by that. He would have no issue, the Chasam Sofer in other words, would have no issue with them and would be very comfortable and proud of them. The significant minority, or perhaps even majority of Satmar, that descend from Oberland Ashkenazi grandparents are extremely proud of that. I think that the term Misnagid just rubs people the wrong way, even if it is somewhat irrelevant today. That is an excellent, fantastic summary. That's the end of the letter, and that's me talking now. I think it's an excellent point, and perhaps I would even expound on that the Satmar Rav himself, with his goals and his vision and his leadership and his overall approach, and it can be illustrated in many ways, which we'll obviously have to save for another episode on the Satmar Rav. I think we have a couple already, but there's definitely more to say on that. But the Satmar Rav himself, with all that, like I said before, his goals, vision, leadership, and overall approach was much more like the Chasam Sofer and continuing his legacy than a Baal Shem Tov Hasidus. It's very likely that the Satmar Rav himself, had he been around in the late 18th century, he might have even been a Misnagid himself. That's another shmooze. That's another discussion regarding the Satmar Rav we'll save for another time, but he himself was much more of a continuation of the Chasam Sofer than of the Baal Shem Tov, if I had to pick one of them. So, let's finally, I think that was valid. I don't think that was a distraction. I think that was a very good point, and I think we can finally put this matter to rest about the Chasam Sofer and Hasidim. I want to, before I get to the youth of the Chasam Sofer, there's something that I share on a lot of my trips, which I feel like should be at some point mentioned. It's such a great tidbit about the Chasam Sofer and his legacy that I share with my groups on the trips to Europe, that why not share it with the great podcast listeners as well. There was a fascinating article authored by none other than the great Rav Meir Shapiro, which is obviously a great continuation from last episode. Last episode was on Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin, and we talked about Rav Meir Shapiro there as well. So this is kind of like a good segue either way. But Rav Meir Shapiro was on a fundraising trip for the Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin, which we mentioned last episode, and he was on his way to London, actually, and he wrote this article for a newspaper, I think in Germany, if I'm not mistaken, and it became a legendary article, and he describes how he visited on the way. You know, if you trace a map across Europe, so he obviously passed through the entire Central Europe, from Lublin, which is all the way in eastern Poland, so he goes through the entire Central Europe. He's going by trains in those days in order to get eventually to London, which is, take a boat eventually, but across Europe, continental Europe, he's taking, the railroads. So he passes through both Pressburg and Prague. And in the article, he describes a very poignant description of Rav Meir Shapiro, and this is in the 1920s, and both Prague and Pressburg had undergone, large secularization, as had Lublin too. Obviously, you're talking about secularization was everywhere. Yet there was something that Rav Meir Shapiro noted when he arrived in Pressburg, that there was still a strong Orthodox community as well, despite the fact that there was, mass secularization in the overall community, Jewish community of Bratislava. It was already at that time. But descendants of the Chasam Sofer were still rabbis of the community, and those same descendants of the Chasam Sofer still ran the original yeshiva of the Chasam Sofer, which was a large yeshiva with hundreds of students, and is still a very prestigious yeshiva in Slovakia, the whole Hungary area, producing graduates who became rabbis across Czechoslovakia and Hungary. And Rav Meir Shapiro said, wow, that's impressive. Chasam Sofer would walk into his own yeshiva today, he would do it with a lot of pride that his approach worked. There's still a community that follows his way. Whereas when he noted that, he said when he walked into the Beis Medrash in Pressburg, he heard students citing the Chasam Sofer's Torah in a lively, passionate fashion. It was alive, it was very real. Whereas when he went to Prague, the secularization there was so extensive that there was almost no Orthodox community to speak of at all in Prague. And when he asked his guide to show him around Jewish Prague, his guide brought him to the Altnei Shul and to the cemetery where the Maharal was buried. And that was it. So it was all in the past. It was all gone of the Orthodox traditional Prague that Rav Meir Shapiro was seeking out, was searching for. And he said that we see, he ends off that article, he says, the Chasam Sofer was right. The Chasam Sofer won. His approach, his legacy, he won. Whatever he taught is working. And the other approach is with the confrontation that the Jewish community facing modernity chose in the 18th and 19th centuries. By the early 20th century, it became apparent that those other approaches did not work. It didn't preserve Judaism. There was rapid assimilation in places like Prague. Whereas in Pressburg, there was still a yeshiva, there was still a strong community. So the Rav Meir Shapiro was concluding nearly a century after the Chasam Sofer's passing, that the Chasam Sofer's approach was a correct one. So that's a very, very powerful statement of Rav Meir Shapiro. So now, if we can finally move to the youth of the Chasam Sofer, he's born in 1762 into an old and prestigious Frankfurt family who was in Frankfurt for centuries, at least from the 16th century. So that's a good 200 years before the Chasam Sofer is born, perhaps even longer. His great-grandfather, just to mention one of them, one of the most famous ones of his ancestors, was Reb Shmuel Shatten. He was known as the Mahar Shashach, who was a rabbi in Frankfurt in the 17th century. And this old Frankfurt tradition would serve as a central anchor in both the Chasam Sofer's thinking, as well as his approach to halacha, psak, minig, communal custom. And it would ironically, also ultimately be a somewhat of a paradox in the Chasam Sofer's life himself, because it was he who cut off this centuries-long family tradition in Frankfurt due to his own unique life circumstances. So he comes from this long tradition, and he spends his whole life trying to uphold this tradition, and it has an impact on the way he paskins and how he attaches custom and his whole Yaki Ashkenaz outlook. And yet he's the one who leaves Frankfurt. He cuts off this long centuries-long familial association with Frankfurt, and that would be kind of like a paradox of his life. So though he eventually left at the age of 20, never to return, he never even came back for a visit. And though even before that, even before he leaves Frankfurt, there was quite a bit of tension in his parents' home and in the community, he moved into his teacher, Rav Nosson Adler's home. So there was already this tension within there, because Nosson Adler, as we'll see, was excommunicated by the Frankfurt community, although that excommunication took place later, but happened in stages. First, there was opposition, general opposition. We'll get to it. We'll get to the whole story, but the Chasam Sofer later on would have some pretty sharp words to say about his beloved hometown, about how they treated Rav Nosson Adler, his beloved rabbi and teacher. So, yet at the same time, he will always refer to himself as Moshe Sofer of Frankfurt am Mainz, which is how he signed every single letter, every single tshuva of his. He always defended the minig and the traditions of the Ashkenazi ancient communities of the Rhine River Valley of southern Germany, of which Frankfurt was the most prominent. And this paradox can be partially explained by understanding the mentality of an immigrant, which was a salient feature of the Chasam Sofer's identity for the rest of his life. He's an immigrant, so he always views his place of origin as an anchor for identity. He sees it with an element of nostalgia, and he sees as a goal of preserving its customs and culture, how he remembers it in his mind from his youth, despite the fact that Frankfurt itself, the Frankfurt Jewish community itself, had undergone drastic social and religious changes during the Chasam Sofer's lifetime following his departure from there. The Chasam Sofer the Frankfurt that the Chasam Sofer remembered no longer existed by the end of his life, but the Chasam Sofer still remembered the old one. Now, from a young age, the Chasam Sofer had three primary teachers, and he studied in three very distinct places. And obviously and famously, his primary teacher was Rav Nosson Adler, and I'd like to devote significant time to discuss the nature of that relationship, since it's likely the most defining feature of the Chasam Sofer's entire life was his relationship with Rav Nosson Adler. So we'll get to that soon and discuss it as much as we can. So first, let's cover the other two teachers that he had. So for a relatively short time, he was a student of the rabbi of Frankfurt at the time of the Chasam Sofer's youth. That was Rav Pinchas Horowitz, the Haflaah, who was also a follower of the Hasidic movement at the court of the Maggid Mizrich. I had an episode on him, discussed him in his own episode some time ago. When the Chasam Sofer was relatively young, possibly even 9 years old, but definitely no later than 11 years old, he became associated with the circle of Rav Nosson Adler, and he emerged as his primary teacher. But a couple of years later, when he was a young teenager, for a 2-year period approximately between 1775 and 1777, he left Frankfurt for a nearby Mainz, Magenza the Jews called it, and studied at the local yeshiva there of Rav David Tevli Shayer. He became very close with him during this time, so he became a third teacher of the Chasam Sofer. But what's even more interesting about his stay in Mainz was another thing occurred there during that time. A young Rav Moshe Sofer was hosted and supported by a local wealthy individual, and he utilized his time there in his home to make use of his extensive library and familiarize himself with general knowledge. He read books in German, possibly even in French, on scientific subjects such as geography, math, history, astronomy, medicine, other sciences, possibly even philosophy. And this support of general knowledge would continue throughout his life. And again, it's another curious paradox in the life and leadership of Chasam Sofer, because he was supportive of knowing, of the knowledge of general knowledge, outside knowledge. So general knowledge is a yes, but any ideology to change the Jewish people or to expose them or change tradition or values or priorities through outside knowledge, that's a firm and decisive no, according to the Chasam Sofer. So the knowledge per se was viewed as a positive thing, and there's examples of that even from his later years. He, in one instance, supported the efforts of Rav David Friesenhuisen, to establish a rabbinical seminary where the rabbinical students would receive a general education along with their rabbinical studies. In 1820, the Chasam Sofer agreed to a school in Pressburg, which would have some subjects to assist them in achieving productivity, which was a term used by the government at the time, to achieve productivity of the Jews. It was demanded by the government, and the Chasam Sofer agreed that they would teach subjects like that in this school. In 1830, 10 years later, he oversaw an Orthodox school opening in Pressburg, which had a full general studies curriculum in addition to the regular Torah subjects. He also hired private tutors for his own children to study general subjects. So again, while he was not fundamentally against outside knowledge per se, he was very, very opposed to how it was presented. If it had any hint of changing priorities, or there was a goal of integration, or changing Jewish identity or observance, then he was not only vociferously opposed to it, he actively combated it with all the force of his energy, leadership, and charisma, and with all the means at his disposal. He was able to perceive the nuance and had the courage to act accordingly, displaying strong leadership in every instance, and that type of nuance is part of the greatness of the Chasam Sofer. So, his primary teacher, like I said, was Rav Nosson Adler, and it's important in the whole context of the whole Rav Nosson Adler story. It was this mystical group of, Kabbalists and using Kabbalistic custom with their own minyan, their own little shul, and controversial customs. And they're eventually forced to leave Frankfurt following sanctions and later a cherem. Rav Nosson Adler himself returns to Frankfurt later on without the Chasam Sofer. The Chasam Sofer parted ways from him in Fürth. Rav Chasam Sofer was engaged. Rav Nosson Adler was involved in his shidduch, actually. And the Chasam Sofer was engaged to his first wife, and he got married and settled in Prustitz, stayed in Moravia. And Rav Nosson Adler returns to Frankfurt. He subsequently sustains another cherem, and the Chasam Sofer maintains a correspondence with him. They send letters to each other, so they maintain the relationship from a distance, because the Chasam Sofer himself never returns to Frankfurt. Now, the cherem on Rav Nosson Adler is rescinded. I hope I pronounced that right. Is taken off a few days prior to his passing. The Frankfurt community takes away his cherem, and history has done Rav Nosson Adler there's some reconciliation, some justice has been done. He was seen following his passing as for the great person he was, and even though during his lifetime he went through a lot of pain and suffering for his deviances of his customs within the community. So Rav Nosson Adler and the Chasam Sofer have this fascinating relationship. Rav Nosson Adler was about 21 years approximately older than the Chasam Sofer, so there's almost a different generation. Rav Nosson Adler was born in 1741, and he passed away in 1800, around 58, 59 years old. And the Chasam Sofer joins his mystical group when he, like I said, at 9, 10, 11 years old. So that means Rav Nosson Adler was in his late 20s, early 30s. This is the early 1770s. So, what's interesting is that the opposition to Rav Nosson Adler, again, he's running this Kabbalistic group, and they have all kinds of customs which are not accepted in the community. He's doing change them. First of all, he has his own minyan, and they daven a different nusach. They daven according to the Arizal, Kabbalistic nusach. They also daven in a Sephardic, with a Sephardic pronunciation of the words, which is also considered controversial at the time. They also have they have the Birkas Kayanim every day, like in Israel today. But this was not in Israel. This was in Frankfurt. And many, many other customs, which I'm not going to get into, because maybe we should devote an episode exclusively to Rav Nosson Adler. Here, I'm just trying to give the context for the Chasam Sofer himself. And the community is not happy with it. Now, what's interesting is that the first time the community acts against Rav Nosson Adler is in 1772, which just so happens to be in 1772 is the same time that the first cherem against the Hasidim in Eastern Europe is promulgated by the Vilna Gaon. And in Brod, in Galicia, and the famous pamphlet Zomir Aritzim V'Charbei Surim, describing the opposition to the Hasidic movement, is published during this time, and a copy of that reaches the Frankfurt of Besdin and Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Nosson Maz, a very prominent personality, and Rav Nosson Maz is the one who leads the charge against Rav Nosson Adler. So it comes from him, and it's definitely related to the fact that there's opposition to Hasidim, because Hasidim in the early stages are seen as very similar to Rav Nosson Adler. Right, Kabbalistic customs, small groups, and of course this is in the shadow of the Frankist movement at the time, and there's a lot to talk about that as well. But there are a lot of suspicions, a lot of anyone who's using Kabbalistic customs, having their own minyanim, changing the davening, doing their own thing, they're separating from the community. Everything is seen with suspicion at the time. Rav Nosson Maz gets the rabbi of the town, Rav Pinchas Horowitz, the Haflaah, to get involved through intermediaries, meaning there's letters sent to the Rabbi Yehuda, who gets involved, and Rabbi Yosef Steinhardt, who's the Rav in Firt, he gets involved, and they all join this opposition to Rav Nosson Adler. First, there's a series of takanas that the Frankfurt community publishes and publicizes, and all of these decrees are clearly, again, you don't mention Rav Nosson Adler by name, but they're clearly against his customs. Each one is targeting a different custom of Rav Nosson Adler, and when that doesn't help, so they place him in cherem, him and his whole group, by the way. So I guess that included the Chasam Sofer in 1779. Rav Nosson Adler, as a result, departs from Frankfurt in 1782. By this time, the Chasam Sofer is 19, 20 years old. He leaves with him. He joins him in the exile. Chasam Sofer never returns. The Rav Nosson Adler is hired as a rabbi in Boskowitz in Moravia, and that's where the Chasam Sofer settles with him. But on the way, they actually have a very interesting encounter in Prague. They meet the Noda B'Yehuda, who was involved in the opposition to Rav Nosson Adler. Yet the two meet, and the Chasam Sofer describes this meeting as the only meeting he had with the great Noda B'Yehuda, the previous, Gadol Hadar, the previous great rabbi of his generation. The Chasam Sofer had the privilege of meeting. This was the only in-person meeting he had with him. They clarified all kinds of things in halacha, some of which were actually related to Rav Nosson Adler's controversial customs. And Chasam Sofer proudly wrote in a couple of tshuvas how the Noda B'Yehuda agreed with some of the points that he made, that the young Chasam Sofer made. And it's another interesting side point to this meeting between the Noda B'Yehuda and Rav Nosson Adler and Chasam Sofer is that the Noda B'Yehuda's assistant was a close student of his at the time, Rav David Tevli. And eventually Rav David Tevli would rise to a very prominent leadership position in Central Europe. And the Chasam Sofer and Rav David Tevli would enjoy for decades a very close relationship. So here are the two young men assisting their teachers, Rav Nosson Adler and the Noda B'Yehuda, are actually laying the groundwork for their own relationship in their respective leadership positions in the Jewish world. But they make it to Bashkovich. The Bashkovich Jewish community is very not happy with Rav Nosson Adler. They're also not happy with the Frankfurt community for not giving them the heads up about the strange Kabbalistic customs of their new rabbi and his students. They do not like his students that he brought with him to town, who are part of his group, and they get rid of him within a year. And Rav Nosson Adler moves to Vienna. The Chasam Sofer lives in Vienna with his teacher. And Vienna, the center of the Habsburg Empire, the center of European culture during the century of the Enlightenment. This is the 1780s. It's shortly before. This is after the Edict of Tolerance of Emperor Joseph of the Habsburgs. This is, almost we're on the brink of the French Revolution. This is the peak of the Enlightenment, and the Chasam Sofer is spending a couple of years of his youth in Vienna. This definitely gave him a strong sense, which would have an impact on a lot of what his leadership later. He saw modernity. He saw it where it was, in the center of it. Not to mention the fact that Pressburg is right next to Vienna. So even when he was the rabbi there for 33 years, he was a stone's throw away from Vienna. And of course, that's today. When we land in Vienna, we go straight to Chasam Sofer. It's right there. It's next to it. It's not far away. So that exposure also has an impact on the Chasam Sofer. So they part ways eventually. Like I said, Chasam Sofer is engaged. He gets married. Rav Nosson Adler returns to Frankfurt. In 1789, he's put in Cherem a second time, and he stays there in Frankfurt for the next 11 years until just 2 weeks before his passing, they take off the Cherem. Chasam Sofer mourned his Rebbe's passing. He was a rabbi in Mattisdorf in Burgenland in 1800, at the time of his passing. And for the rest of his life, his relationship with him was at the center of every part of the Chasam Sofer who he was. Now, there's many stories between the two, like tons, loads of stories between Rav Nosson Adler and Chasam Sofer, mostly from their time that they wandered together through Europe, their wanderings. Many of those stories are actually true. I believe there's tens or maybe even hundreds of these stories out there, and I'm going to leave them out. I'm not going to mention them in the current podcast for a simple reason that the Chasam Sofer Chevra, those guys, especially the Einaklach of the Chasam Sofer, they absolutely love relating these stories of the Rav Nosson Adler and the Chasam Sofer. So my recommendation to all the listeners out there, do a kind deed for another Jew this week. Approach the local Chasam Sofer Einakel in your shul or community or your neighborhood and tell them that you were listening to Jewish History Soundbites about the Chasam Sofer and Nosson Adler, and that he recommended that you speak to an Einakel about the stories, to hear some stories about Rav Nosson Adler and Chasam Sofer and the relationship between the two, and you'll probably make his day. So that would be something to do. I'll just mention two of those stories, just because, why not? One is timely. It's related to Purim. It seems like Chasam Sofer was in some sort of danger, and to defend himself against an assailant, the end result of that defense against this assailant was that the attacker of the Chasam Sofer did not survive the Chasam Sofer defending himself, and the Chasam Sofer was very disturbed that he had been responsible for someone's death, albeit it was in self-defense. So he discussed it with Rav Nosson Adler, and Rav Nosson Adler, based on his Kabbalistic and mystical knowledge, he comforted him, and he said that his attacker actually was from Amalek. So he was able to do the mitzvah of a timcha zecher Amalek, getting rid of Amalek. Another story has them stuck in a snowdrift with a wagon driver, and the wagon driver hitched an ox together with the horse to schlep them out of the snowdrift. And Rav Nosson Adler jumped off the carriage. They had this opportunity to observe the incredibly rare mitzvah of kilayim with animals. There's many, many stories in that same vein. But that's a little bit about the youth of the Chasam Sofer, and we'll continue with him in future episodes. This is Yehuda Geber, Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on all podcast platforms, and I hope you enjoyed.